You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about contemporary photography from Africa, specifically about the new book called Africa State of Mind, and we're going to be joined by its author, Ekow Eshun. Ekow, who's joining us from London via Skype, is a writer, curator, journalist, and broadcaster. He's written for publications including the New York Times, the Financial Times, and The Guardian. His previous books include Black Gold of the Sun from 2005 and Africa Modern in 2017. And of course, he's with us today to speak about his latest book, Africa State of Mind, which profiles more than 50 contemporary photographers from the many countries and cultures in modern-day Africa. Though the book includes a brief timeline of the history of photography in Africa dating back to the late 1800s, all of the photographs featured in the four main chapters of this book were taken in the 21st century and most within the last 10 years. With 250 images and insightful commentary by Ekow, this gorgeous book brings together a generation of African photographers from a range of genre to share their diverse visions of contemporary Africa. Welcome to the show, Ekow.
Thank you very much, Alan.
I just want to tell you that this morning I had a lot of trouble with your book because I was trying to put together a quick summary of, some of the what I would say, in my opinion, the better photographers, and I use that word better really loosely, okay? Yeah. And I had to stop after a while because just about every single photographer in this book just did something to me. The range of imagery and styles is really wonderful, and some of them can be really disturbing, and some of them just make you crack up because the humor is really universal. There's some great stuff in here. Let's start off with the subtitle of the book is Contemporary Photography Reimagines a Continent. Is the idea of reimagining at the heart of the book? Was that part of the criteria in terms of which the artists were included? And what's your idea of the word reimagined? In any order you can answer that. Go ahead.
That's a really good question. I think my start point with this really goes back historically. So look, I'm sitting in London. I wrote and researched the book in London, and my family comes from Ghana in West Africa, and I've been conscious all my life, really, of I would say let's call it a complicated relationship that photography has with Africa. And, one's very aware of that, sitting in the West and being of African origin, which is to say that, if we go back in time, photography arrives in Africa in the mid to late 19th century. And probably for about 100 years from that moment onwards, throughout the colonial period and kind of periods of empire and so on, kind of photography plays a particular role, which is really, I would say, to kind of come up with a visual representation of Africa and African people as some sort of kind of Victorian stereotype, a Victorian cliche of a people in a heart of darkness, of people outside history, people outside civilization. And time and again, photographs reinforce these kind of impressions all the way through to, it has to be said, some aspects of now. So we still see charity images of forlorn African children. We're still used to visual representations of Africa as a land of famine and warfare and so on. And so when I think about reimagining the continent, one of the things I'm really interested in is how contemporary photographers on the African continent or in the African diaspora, kind of African origin, in countries around the world, look at Africa in light of that history and consciously or sometimes not consciously actively seek to confound, to contradict, to overturn, to reimagine some of the ways that the continent has been presented and remains in the popular imagination.
How much of a blur do you think there is between the way the photographers have evolved from, imitating what was like, the great white hunter experience of photography and all that stuff? A lot of our impressions come from Tarzan movies from the 30s. Let's be honest here. At least, it's true to say that. But I also noticed that it might be a common thread with just creative types, that there were definitely some styles I saw there. Some of the stuff I looked at was so reminiscent of some of the portraits, specifically of, say, what Irving Penn would do. But I have no idea if the photographers had ever even seen any of Penn's work.
Okay, so look, so two things with that. One is that pretty much I would say, I was kind of researching the book for a year and a half or so. One of the things is that even photographers who are just based in their country and for different reasons don't necessarily travel that much have got a very broad appreciation, education, understanding of photographic practice. They're professional photographers and they're interested in photography as a medium, as a movement, as an art form. So most of them have a very international perspective. A number of them show internationally, whether they're kind of necessarily well known or not, but they've all got quite a broad perspective on photography. They've all got an understanding of art historical and Western photographic traditions. They also have an understanding of some of the ways that African photographers historically have looked at Africa and African people. So when it comes to portraiture, we can cite Irving Penn. And in fact, there's one photographer, Lele Essaidi, who was a Moroccan photographer, who explicitly cites him as an influence. But equally, many, especially the portraitists, cite the legacy of great Malian portrait photographers Malik Sidibé and Seydou Keita, who were taking photographs in the post-war years in Mali in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and who had an exhilarating, exuberant photographic style that has subsequently been recognized all around the world. They're recognized as master portraitists, and you see the influence of their work in photographers in West Africa, but also photographers all the way across the continent. Anytime you see an African studio photographer, one of the questions they'll be asking themselves is, how am I working in relation to, in distinction to, possibly in contradiction to the work of Malik Sidibé or Seydou Keita, because their influence is so great that it remains to this day.
Yeah. And those photographs are powerful. I mean, you could almost contrast them to a lot of the photographers from here in the States in the 50s and 60s. It's incredible, some of the parallel visions that I saw going on there. Yeah. Some of the humor is wonderful, by the way.
Well, what do you like in that respect? Let's have a think. What are you looking at when you say that?
I'm trying to figure out which was it. This was Samuel Fosso. Okay, in particular,
yeah.
I love what he's doing. I mean, here's a guy who has a portrait studio. He opened it at the age of 13, and he took portraits. And at the end of the day, he had film left over in his camera, and he would use himself as a model. And some of the situations and the outfits he had. These were meant to be private photographs, but they're stunning portraits, self-portraits that you could see so many dimensions of this person. What I liked about it is that his work in particular was the way he highly stylized the backgrounds of his portraits and the borders of his portraits with things laying around the house like pots and pans and sheets and blankets. And a lot of the photographers were working with very minimalistic tools and backgrounds, yet were able to convey and get very strong photographs over, be they portraits or anything else. It's a tapestry of photography. It just is.
Yeah, I mean, it's all of those things. And I think that when you talk, Alan, about humor, there's absolutely a self-awareness of what's going on, a self-awareness of putting yourself, in the case of Samuel Fosso, putting yourself in front of the camera, recognizing the performative quality of what you're doing, recognizing the fact that this isn't that you're dressing up, that you're playing for the camera, that you're playing a role, because he used to dress up in all sorts of kind of outfits that kind of parodied what was going on around him in 70s Central Africa. But the photos are kind of delicious, they're sort of funny and insightful, but they're also beautiful as well.
Yes. And again, there's that little element of tongue in cheek in a lot of them that are lovely. And there are a lot of them very dead serious that are just, they just get you right between the eyes.
This is kind of a two-part question. I do want to kind of jump back a little bit to this idea that, you mentioned the photographers reimagining. And is this something that each of the photographers would probably claim as part of their work? Or is this something that as a curator you saw in their work and decided that, they belong in this group? And maybe, starting with that, we can lead to some of the the aspects of the research that you did, and if you were familiar with all these photographers prior to starting the book, and who you discovered.
Yeah. I mean, so to start with a second, I mean, look, as the curator of this, because, I've done the book, and there's also been an Africa State of Mind exhibition, and there's going to be a further exhibition. So I've been looking at and thinking about the work of these photographers for a long time and about how to gather that work together. So, each of these photographers is pursuing their own path. I don't know how many of them, if any of them, would say, okay, I'm reimagining Africa, because that's a kind of grand statement. What I was interested in, however, I'm interested in them as artists. And for me, an artist, photographer, or any other kind of visual artist is someone who has the freedom to imagine their own world on their own terms and to make that real through the medium that they work in. And what I was most interested in here is how we might be able to look at Africa through the eyes of these 50 plus photographers, each of whom has a very individual take on the place. And what you get collectively from that, I think, is this imagining or reimagining, depending what your perspective in the first place is, of the continent. So I don't claim that there's a kind of single shared point of view or aesthetic that I'm trying to capture. I was more interested in what happens when you stand and look through the eyes or through the lenses of all these different figures. What do you start to see? And what you see is something that's by turns compelling or dreamlike or strange or beguiling or sensual or sensory. You see all these different textures and takes and tonalities that come into play. And what I found so beguiling and so fascinating about that is that I think it prompts you to a recognition of both, to some extent, how familiar some aspects of this are and how unfamiliar those are, and how I think one can start to look at Africa with hopefully an open framework, with hopefully a way of seeing that says, oh, I find connection here, but also I'm in some new territory here. And that's what seemed to me so fascinating. So, reimagining is both a formal process, as I was saying earlier, in light of the kind of history of photography, but it's also just about personal subjective takes on place.
And again, were you kind of in your work, you've been familiar with these photographers for years, or at least some amount of time? Or was there anyone that just blew you away, a surprise that?
Yeah, I mean, look, actually, so many of them. There was a number of them that I knew, but the more I kept looking, the more I kept finding. I tell you what, look, I'm actually in perpetual pain right now. I live in a terrible state because I keep coming across yet more photographers who I wish I could have included in the book. And that's a kind of feeling of perpetual regret. But it was a really exciting process, putting the book together, because every time I kept looking, and that looking involved traveling somewhat to South Africa, to Mali, to different parts of Africa, but it also meant going to different photo fairs and festivals and art fairs and exhibitions. It was a process of concerted looking for quite a long time. Every time I looked, I found more work. I found work sometimes that I was attracted to and then discarded. I found work that I remained deeply driven by, deeply compelled to keep looking at. I found work that I needed to decipher, that I needed to take time to consider and explore. So much. It was a completely engrossing experience.
Where are you looking for your work, if I may ask? I mean, what are your sources? I mean, is it magazines? Is it Instagram? Or what are your?
Yeah, it's a bit of everything. I mean, a lot of photographers are on Instagram, but the big struggle, in a way, genuinely, was you can see a set of images and they look fantastic, but actually, the question for me is, do they do more than just look great? Do they tell a story? Do they open up a field of inquiry? Do they ask questions? Do they prompt me to look and think in ways that I hadn't anticipated before? So my criteria wasn't just the photos have to look astonishing or strange or beguiling or anything else. they also have to, they also have to work as artworks, which is to say, works that interrogate or scrutinize the contemporary condition, that make us think, that allow us to open up our own heads and our own thinking. So while I was putting together the book, I have all sorts of lists, have all sorts of people that I'm looking at and considering. I have to, each time I find someone, and a lot of the work of necessity is online, each time I find someone's work, then I have to dig deeper into that work. I have to look across a lot of their work that's published to think about, well, can we sum up their practice in one set of images? Is there enough to talk about here? Are they serious artists? So, the work was about, it was a sort of chain. I find one image that leads me to something else, and then I see whether that is part of a sustained body of work, whether that's part of a committed practice from a photographer whose work can be really rewarding. The ideal is someone picks up the book, they look inside it, they find the work of a photographer, they delve deeper into that work, they find a world, So I wanted to make sure with each person that I chose, there was something there beyond simply a photograph, beyond simply an image. I was interested in photographers who can expand our state of mind.
You accomplished that very well. Because again, as we're talking, I'm still going through the book for the umpteenth time, and it really is. If this was an LP, a musical album, every track would be very, very different, and they're interrelated in many ways. You could see how some of them connect, not all of them, but it's kind of amazing to see how people see kind of the same things.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about the influence of art schools? I mean, would you say that most of these photographers have gone in some ways to some kind of art school, whether that be, in Africa or in Europe?
A fair number of them have in different places. I mean, let's have a think. So if you look in the book, what you see is there's actually quite a wide representation from South Africa.
Yeah.
I think more than any country, that there are more photographers from South Africa. That's because South Africa has got a long tradition of photographic practice. In the apartheid years, photography is really, really important as a mode of activism against the apartheid regime. But out of that, you get places like the Market Photo Workshop in Johannesburg, which is a really, really important training ground for photographers, and a number of the photographers in this book come through from there. But also, South Africa's got some very good art schools as well. Some places have a real tradition of visual education. Some other places don't, but they have more informal traditions that way. Some other places are actually starting to come up. Ghana in West Africa, for instance, I think there might be only one photographer from Ghana, but he studied at Kumasi University, which is a really interesting university in the center of Ghana, which is now beginning to send out a lot of visual artists, photographers, and other forms of artists whose work is being seen internationally right now. So that place is becoming its own center for artistic practice. So it's a sort of uneven topography. Some places are ahead of others, but a fair number of the photographers have got a background in visual art itself. And then beyond that, as I was saying, a lot of them are just are professionally interested in visual culture. They're interested in photography, they're interested in fine art, and they're interested in the role they can play as photographers in thinking about and in interrogating, and if you want, moving forward the culture both in their country but also internationally in terms of visual culture generally.
If I may ask a question, we're talking about mostly fine art photographers and documentary people and portraits. How big is the advertising and commercial fields of photography in Africa? I would imagine there's got to be a home-based operation there. There got to be.
Yeah. I mean, there's absolutely like in every country there are homegrown advertising and commercial image world. I mean, some with varying degrees of sophistication, it has to be said, but I'm looking, there is at least one photographer. There's a couple of photographers in the book that come out of that tradition. There's a photographer called Osborne Macharia, who's born in Kenya, who's a commercial photographer who in Kenya shoots a lot of campaigns, who's worked with quite big brands, and who's created this kind of deliberately kind of fantastic set of images of slightly kind of superheroic type images. And because as much as anything else, he's used to working with quite high-end equipment, quite high-end visual rendering. So he can create these fantastical scenarios quite easily with the equipment he has and with the kind of facilities at his disposal. Again, I was interested here in commercial photographers whose work moves over into, whatever we call it, a kind of artistic territory. Just as also there are photographers in here who take photos for the New York Times or for Vogue or for other commercial magazines and international news media. But always, I think, what I was really interested in is I was trying to find photographers who aren't interested per se in reality, who aren't interested per se in documentary reportage, who aren't interested in trying to create visual representations of the ordinary world, who don't claim that their photos are what is. I was interested in photographers who were interested in recreating the world on their own terms, rather than whose job it is to go out and snap a reportage photo, and for that just to be a kind of news image or a reportage or a documentary image that tells us the world. For me, Africa's State of Mind is about, as we've been saying, a psychological space as much as a physical space. This is about how one can dream Africa into being. This is about how photographers can use their cameras and their lenses to see and re-see and unsee and see the world in terms we might not anticipate.
All right, we are going to take a short break, and we're going to be back with more with Ekow Eshun and his new book, Africa's State of Mind. Stay tuned.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. The best way to support the show is by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For links to gear and more information on today's guests, check out the show notes in your podcast app or visit our homepage on the B&H Explorer website and join the B&H Photography Podcast Facebook group. And now, back to the show.
Okay, we are back. John, you wanted to ask a question.
The one question I wanted to get at is kind of how you thematize the book. You divide it into 4 sections, and I'll read the names of the sections. It's kind of an interesting. It's kind of not what I expected when I started the book to see how you were going to break it down. It's hybrid cities, zones of freedom, myth and memory, and inner landscapes. And if you could talk a little bit how you came up with those themes, and did the themes then influence who you chose to be involved, or you kind of created the themes after you had the photographers?
And I'll throw another one into that, if I may. Are there any other photographers here who you had a problem with because they fit into more than one category? Because I think you have that here.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's work backwards from that. So look, a lot of these photographers could have sat in more than one category, which for me actually is a healthy sign. It's a healthy sign about the depth and range and artistic ambition of their work. And also, I think it's a signal to me anyway, that these categories they're not really fixed. They're ways of gathering work or of shaping ideas. I don't think about them as cut and dried. Like if you are interested in photographing the city, you can't be interested in photographing individuals and making portraits. It doesn't really work that way, I think. So those chapters are guides, really. They're ways of looking and ways of seeing. But I mean, just to take them, hybrid cities, that was a way of looking at how photographers look at the urban city, look at fast developing African cities as these sites of kind of mass movement and people and commerce and traffic and change. Inner landscapes is about photographers who are casting this kind of very poetic, personal, subjective representations of the environment around them. Zones of Freedom is about photographers who are looking at the self, at the body, at gender, at sexuality, also within the context of a continent where many countries have laws against homosexuality. So I was interested in how photographers look at questions of sexuality and gender within that kind of context. And a 4-section Myth and Memory looks at how photographers gather together history and collective memory and folklore and myth and turn those into compelling images and dreamscapes.
Yeah, that one seems to be in some ways maybe the most difficult. No, in some ways, I'm sure that it's hard to make choices when there's a lot of great photographers out there. But specifically because that may be dealing with the issues that we started out talking about, which is kind of reimagining the how Africa has been portrayed over the years, and then this reimagination.
For me, actually, that was one of the most pleasurable sections to work on, actually. There's one photographer, Leonoraris Victor, whose work looks at the sort of historical, or some of the work, and the work featured in the book, looks at the historical relationship between America, Africa, and Liberia, which is the country of her parents' origin, and looks at the kind of history of African Americans going back to Liberia in the 19th century, which is it's a complicated history. But the results, the images that she creates are astonishing. They're beautiful and strange. She creates these kind of gilded photographs, which are gilded and embossed in gold leaf. She is there at the center of them. They're kind of self-portraits, but they're somewhere between painting and photography. She casts herself as this strange, mythic figure. She references Greek myth in there as well. And so what I love is that we can look at political history. We can end up with poetry.
Hey, well, I like that.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. You mentioned her and other photographers who, I'm not sure if they were born outside of Africa, but certainly there's several who, either live outside of Africa or have feet in both, in both Europe, America, and Africa. And is it possible to kind of talk about that in the sense of how their depictions might differ from somebody who was born, lived, the whole time?
Yeah, I mean, I decided to make no necessary distinction between photographers of African origin who are based on the continent or who aren't based on the continent. In that, I'm in one of those categories myself. My parents come from Ghana. My family comes from Ghana. I've lived most of my life in Britain. I consider myself British. I consider myself Ghanaian. And I'm less interested from that personal basis. I can't claim, therefore, that this book will tell you an authentic story of Africa or Africanness. And I'm not sure such a thing can be created. I'm interested in how all these photographers, from their individual position or perspective or place, has a point of view on the African experience, on African identity, on African subjectivities. I feel they're allowed that position as people of African origin who have, and they all have, should be said, they all have direct relationships. They're all, at the very least, stubby, their parents.
Did you ever consider, including a non-African photographer who
I mean,
that you might respect?
I felt that it was interesting to try and gather photographers who had a direct, familial relationship with Africa. There are many good books that look wider at the African diaspora. I thought it was interesting here to try and limit myself, and in the limiting, to actually show the richness possible from that process. So if we start to reinterpret across the African diaspora, then it gets very, very wide, and almost the task becomes impossible.
You already have so many photographers here. If you expanded it beyond this, you're not sticking in one volume. You have to get some very thin pages.
That's another call for volume 2,
Yeah.
What about just the immigration experience, though?
So the other criteria that I wanted is that I wanted all the photos, or as far as possible, I wanted the photos to be photos that were shot in Africa. So even if we're dealing with photographers who are moving, photographers who've emigrated from Africa or were born outside Africa, I wanted the work to itself represent Africa. So again, so that we could see Africa through their eyes. So for instance, there's one photographer, a Moroccan born photographer called Hassan Hajjaj, who's based in the UK and in Morocco. His photos are this amazing kind of hybrid take on North Africanness, on Muslimness, on Westernness, all at the same time. Typically, he uses Western brands like Nike or Coca-Cola. He drops them into the frame of his photos. His photos reference the tropes of Western fashion photography, but they also are fascinated by kind of views of Muslimness, quote unquote, so that, the pictures of the women will be wearing veils, but the kind of, the veils and the head wraps will have Louis Vuitton, embossed logos of them on them. He's really influenced by hip hop culture, amongst other things. So his work, for me, is about the experience of immigration as a cosmopolitan condition, immigration as a condition where you don't leave one aspect of yourself behind in the traveling. So although he's based primarily now in London, he has a point of view which is about how can you gather together a sensibility that considers both the West and North Africa and doesn't try to operate on a zero-sum game of leaving one behind and picking one up, another thing up, but is about this sensibility of hybrid simultaneity.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a great point, and I love that photographer's work. Quick, I wonder if we could ask a couple of questions about some specific photographers. A couple that I liked, and I know Alan, as he was saying, has a long list, and the list just grows every page you turn.
And I narrowed it down to 240 out of 250. I'm still trying to get through it now.
I mean, you mentioned already Osborne Macharia, and I really like that work. This kind of Afrofuturist, as you called it. Those portraits are incredible. And he specifically says, he's trying to overturn historical cliches. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add about him. Another photographer whose work I really like, and I hope I'm pronouncing it right, but Lebohang Gagne,
Lebohang Kganye. These
kind of wonderful double exposures with her and her own mother. I thought that was really powerful.
Yeah, well, I mean, those are really beautiful. It's interesting when you actually see them. When you see them physically as photos, they're actually very small photos. Mm-hmm. They're almost like snapshots.
Yeah, you get that sense. You kind of get that sense. Yeah.
And there's a beautiful, intimate story to these photos. So Lebohang, she's a young South African photographer. Her mother died a few years ago. She was distraught at the loss of her mother, but she also recognized after a couple of years that she was losing sight or losing memory of her mother. She was doubly sad at this, and she started to think about how she might be able to hold on to the memory of her mother. And so she found these old family photos of her mother in, different circumstances, dressed up or at home or whatever. And Lebohang digitally inserted herself into the image. But before she did that, she also found some of her mother's old clothes. She dressed up in some of those old clothes, or she dressed up in versions of those old clothes, and inserted herself into the picture so that she acts like a ghostly memory recreation of her mother, so that both mother and daughter are in the same picture, so that she brings herself as physically close as she can do to the form or the image of her mother. So the photographs become these acts of memory and recapturing, of tribute, but also of mourning and of loss. And they're really beautiful works.
Some of the photographers also that I noticed that just stood out for me, and they're very different. Philippe Branquino.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And these are just all common spaces like libraries, a projection booth in a theater, office spaces, but they are so powerful as just ordinary interiors. I also loved Edson Chagas.
Yes.
Now, these are great. They're passport photographs of people dressed as if they're going for a passport, but they're wearing African masks.
Yeah.
And the contrasts are great against the white background. And then finally, and again, I'm going to guess the name, Maimouna Gueresi.
Yes, yeah.
They are powerful, and the compositions and just everything about them are phenomenal. And we can go on. I mean, every single time you open up to another photographer, it's a whole new experience here.
Well, I mean, look, each of those photographers and pretty much most of the photographers in the book, look, frankly, each of them deserves, and sometimes, in some respects, you could write a book about each of them.
Yeah.
Because
these are snapshots. That's all they are, really. Yep.
Exactly. Because let's take Philippe Branquino for a start. He's a Mozambican photographer. He grew up in Mozambique, but he left Mozambique to study architecture in Brazil. He comes back to Maputo, the capital of Mozambique, later on in his life as an adult. He photographs these public spaces, really, cinemas and museums. They're all empty of people to some extent. They all look semi-abandoned, although they're working places. And he's really interested just in the history of Mozambique and its long history as a site of colonialism, as a site of independence, and these public spaces, which in a way mirror the kind of shifting politics of the country from colonialism to independence in 1975, followed by socialism, communism, civil war, democracy. All of these things he's trying to fold into these quiet spaces, which look like they're full of history. They look like they're full of the past. They're worn, they're weathered, but he finds something warm and beautiful in their emptiness and in their stillness. So he's packing, there's a lot that's going on in each of his pictures. And
he's also, if I may add, he's an expert at composition. Every single one of these photographs compositionally is perfect. I'm not going to say the word very good. I'm going to say perfect.
Yeah, exactly. I think you've hit it exactly right there. So, he's photographing what should be dull, nondescript blank spaces, behind the scenes at a cinema, an empty theatre with empty rows of seats and slightly battered flooring and walls. And yet you can't take your eyes off them, can you?
Are most of these photographers, exhibiting regularly? Are they recognized, in their communities and their art communities, and even taking that further? I mean, I know like Zanele, Muholi, and Pieter Hugo are internationally well known, but do they exhibit in Europe and in the States as well?
Yeah, I mean, probably about half of them have international careers, and those careers go from either exhibiting internationally to being shown in international magazines or media. So someone like Hassan Hajjaj, for example, he has just had a very big show in Paris. He's shown all over the world, but he also takes photos for Vogue, for New York magazine. He's photographed people like Cardi B and Billie Eilish on magazine covers. So, these are people who do have international careers in some respects. And even if they don't, they're working really hard. Young Ghanaian photographer Eric Giampfi, he's had different international awards. I saw his work originally when it was selected by the New York Times for a series of photos. Although I'm not sure if he's ever shown in America. I don't know. He might have, but I don't think he has. But it's a really interesting time, essentially, where being geographically based in one location is not a barrier to having your work shown in other places. We live in a visual culture right now. And you see these photographers absolutely benefiting from that, whether that's in terms of exhibition work, or whether that's just in terms of the circulation of their images. And I think the combination of those is encouraging yet more people to become photographers in Africa, because there's more opportunity for that work to be seen. There's more opportunity for that work to be understood, not just in a local context, but in an international context. And certainly the success of someone, as you mentioned, like Zanele Muholi, who was supposed to have a solo show at Tate Modern in London, which was supposed to open right now, but obviously everything's shut, is an indication absolutely of how being a photographer from Africa is not a barrier to international profile. And I think that is only encouraging or yet more people to become photographers.
Her Aperture book is something that, has taken the world by storm, and I was there in Aperture a few weeks before all this started, and it sold out completely. You just can't. She's astonishing. She's astonishing as a photographer. She's astonishing as a person, really, to speak to her. And for me, she's absolutely indicative of the level of sophistication, the level of artistic acuity and insight that you see when you delve into what's happening photographically in Africa right now. She's absolutely at the acme, at the peak of all of this, but she's not alone. And let's say if you were to do a volume 2, is there some aspect of life or even a region that you think is underrepresented in this book and you'd like to kind of get it out there?
One of the things is actually just how little seen whole decades of photographic practice on the African continent have been. We can talk about Malik Sidibe's educator Samuel Fosso, and these are the significant figures whose work has been seen from the 50s through to the 70s. But actually, there are
a whole bunch of other ones, right?
A whole bunch of others. So my fantasy reversioning of this book, as well as the 50 plus contemporary photographers, there are 50 plus photographers from the early 20th century through to across the 20th century, let's say, because this is a 21st century book. I think that, there's an accompanying 20th century book as well, which isn't about balancing one against the other. It's just about saying that there's so much to explore.
Yeah, that's always
so much
been
underexplored.
It's kind of always been tricky because you want to wrap up a whole decade with just one photographer, and that's just ridiculous. There's another photographer that had a really nice show here last year, Sori Sanley. I think he's from Burkina Faso. That was a really nice show, and I think it opened his work to a lot of people, at least in New York.
Yeah, well, I mean, exactly. So he's a perfect example of a photographer whose work, unless you've been looking, you won't necessarily recognize. So he was from where? He was from Burkina Faso, I think.
Yes.
He was taking photos primarily in the 1970s. And the beautiful, expressive studio portrait photography, really wonderful work. And little seen.
Right.
I'm just always caught because there's so much that I see right now that makes me excited in terms of the contemporary moment. But I'm also aware that there's a lot that deserves being researched and being uncovered and explored and enjoyed from earlier periods.
You touched on this a bit earlier, and as you mentioned, there's a lot of South African photographers, and we know that Mali has a tradition. Are there hubs that you would say are kind of the traditional hubs of photography, art photography anyway? And is there any other, locations that are kind of up and coming locations, cities, movement?
Where's the Berlin of Africa?
Well,
Seriously.
I mean, that's a good question. So South Africa, has got the most kind of fully fledged area at the moment. Also, they've got big expensive galleries right now, so there's kind of room there. I kind of wanted to avoid, and it's so seductive to do, is to think too geographically about this. The thing that excites me so much is that you can look at almost any country and almost any territory and find these kind of seeds and find these kind of flourishings. What I'm super excited by at the same time as that is what happens when you look across the continent, not to flatten territory, but to recognize that there are artistic connections and lineages and possibilities and affinities that you can start to detect across territory. And it seems to me that in terms of the job of reimagining the continent, one of the things to do is to break out of some of those historical or some of those geographical parameters, which themselves are a legacy
Certainly.
of empire
Absolutely.
and colonialism, and think rather about Africanness, whatever that means, and how through these photographers, that idea is being imagined, reimagined, interpreted, represented over and over again.
Ekow, it was wonderful talking about your book. I have to just add one more little thought, is that when we were in the office, now we're all working remotely for the time being, it's not unusual for us to get books sent to us from various publishers because everybody wants to get publicity. And when I opened up this book, I stopped and I called everybody over to say, okay, guys, this one you have to take a look at. It really is a truly impressive book. It's beautifully designed. It's well produced. Your writing is wonderful in it, and there's just enough information. And I personally got a tremendous amount of insight on a topic that I really knew very little about. And I have to say thank you. It's a terrific book and a terrific experience, and wonderful having you here to talk about it and give us a little bit further insight. If people want to see more of what you're up to, where can they go to? Websites or Instagrams or anything of that sort?
Yeah, they can follow me on Instagram, Ekow Eshun. I'm normally up to something in terms of writing or making exhibitions, although it's a quiet time for all of us right now. But yeah, they can follow me very easily on Instagram.
Okay. And again, it's Ekow Eshun, that's Eshun, and the book is Africa State of Mind, Contemporary Photography Reimagines a Continent. Don't miss it.
The best place to find the book would be
through the publisher, through Amazon, through any retail or online sites. It's widely distributed internationally.
And the publisher is Thames and Hudson. That's Thames and Hudson. And they, by the way, produce many good books. We've had a lot of good books from this company come our way, and it's definitely on our radar. In the meantime, if you are not a subscriber to our podcast, well, we won't yell at you this time around, but it's easy to subscribe to. Just go over to wherever you get your podcast from and sign up. And we have over 4 years worth of episodes, over 200 of them, and there's some terrific topics. In the meantime, my name is Alan Weitz, and on behalf of John and Jason, thank you so much as always for tuning in, and be safe out there.